Thank you, thank you. I am so lucky to be up here on this stage, and I mean it, lucky. And my path, my interaction with luck happened when Gizmodo stole a prototype of the iPhone. And that made Steve Jobs very mad, and they had a very public squabble over it, and they were getting tons and tons of traffic to their website. So they scoured the internet for content that they thought might keep that interest going, and somehow they just found my blog, which at the time had about 1,000 readers, and I had written this piece about the psychology of brand loyalty. And it really wasn't all that applicable to what was happening, but it had the words Apple in it a couple times. And so they put it up on their website, and they put a link back to me, and 3 months later, I had a book deal. And then a couple years later, I had a second book, and then I just turned in my newest book 3 days ago. So of all the things that I've done to get up here on this stage, it really does all boil down to luck. And I say that because I know so many people who are much more talented than me and who are a lot smarter than me who don't get invited to get up on stages to give people advice. So since I am on the stage, I would like to give you some advice. Beware advice from people on stages. Because usually the only people that get invited to get up on a stage and give advice are extremely lucky to be there. And they can't really easily give you advice on how to be lucky. And so with that in mind, I would like to give you some advice on how to be lucky. And I want to get started by showing you this slide here. So this is familiar to some of you, I'm sure. This is part of your world. This is the diffusion of innovation's S-curve. This is something that sociology discovered in the 1940s when they're trying to figure out how did hybrid corn become the most popular corn all throughout Iowa and eventually take over all of the United States. And they found that the way it did it was there were a few innovators at first, and those innovators introduced it into the world, and then a group of early adopters became fascinated with it. They were nerds, they were corn nerds. And then those corn nerds then introduced it to the persuadable majority who were hesitant at first, but they saw how much fun they were having with it, and then it saturated the entire world. And they found over the last 60 years, this is how everything spreads, how every idea spreads in every marketplace. The marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of products. This is how smartphones and Facebook and everything else has spread around the world. And if you take that S-curve and you then change it into a distribution of the populations of each group of people as it's being adopted, you get this nice bell curve, and you have this little spot right there. You see all the early adopters. And this has really, I think, boggled the minds of a lot of people for a long time. You get a lot of really weird advice because of this. Because although this is nice when things catch on, most things do not catch on. Most things fail. Most things do not survive. So most things get to right about here and stop. And this has created an industry of people who tell you what you ought to do. An industry of people who invite people up on stages, an industry of people who interview very famous super successes, and we all are fascinated in trying to learn, maybe I can do what they did so that my thing can do what their thing did. And if it does, it'll look like this. And everything that didn't look like this, it's because it didn't cross that gap, or as they say, cross the chasm. And the thing is, all of these people can't give you advice on what not to do, because for their thing that did this, everything worked out for them. They were extremely lucky. And I think this is an unpalatable thing for most of us to hear, because whether we think the world is deterministic or we think we're in control, we don't like the idea that it's driven by randomness and chaos. But it's okay if you have a post-scientific understanding of what luck really is. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in just a minute. Thanks to some work in psychology, sociology, neuroscience, and network science, we have a much better understanding of the phenomenon, the natural phenomenon of luck. Just like we have a better understanding of weather, and we no longer have a mythological idea of how it works. We no longer have a mythological idea of how luck works. But we're still super fascinated with these successful people. And I want to tell you a story about why that is, what the bias is that's at work behind this. The story starts in New York City, in an apartment complex overlooking Morningside Heights. Now, this is what it looks like today, but in the 1940s, the people walking around on the street would have had no idea that 4 stories above them, a group of mathematical soldiers were daily engaged in statistical combat, creating equations that would both snuff and spare several 100,000 human lives. Because it was war. It was World War II. And the innovations that had been created during the period of time leading up to war had made war more complex than it ever could have been before. And war was already extremely complex. You had things that were introduced into the world that had just been unveiled at the World's Fair, and they were now cracking that world apart. Radar and sonar and aircraft technology, electronics technology. There were now submarines and tank divisions and long-range bomber squadrons. And to modernize, what the commanders at that time needed were computers. But in 1941, computers were these big clunky affairs made out of vacuum tubes and telephone switches, and they weren't up to the task. And calculators were still mechanical. They were basically a hybrid of a typewriter and a cash register, so they weren't reliable either. But the world did have all the computers it would ever need. The United States had everything they required to make sense of things. It's just that the most powerful number crunchers in World War II during 1941 ran on toast and coffee. And the United States took all of these number crunchers they had on hand, and many of them were at their universities, and some of them had escaped the war from their home countries, and they assembled them into 11 meat-based mainframes. And these meat-based mainframes tried to solve the hard questions, the hard puzzles of mathematical analysis during World War II for the duration of the war. This is one of those. This is the Philadelphia computing section, a group of all-women mathematicians who calculated ballistic tables by hand, day after day, week after week. And each one of these different groups, they were a different leaf on a new branch of the military called the Department of War Math, which is a lie. I made that up. I just think it would be really cool if they were called the Department of War Math. It would make for a much better story. Because they were known by this really unsexy name, the Applied Mathematics Panel. And the job of the Applied Mathematics Panel was to be sort of military-based tech support. When they had a problem in the field they could not solve, it was too complicated for the brain to work out. They sent it to these brainiacs, these meat-based mainframes, and they worked it out. They figured it out. Code breaking, the atomic bomb, all sorts of things came out of their work. But as the war went forward, the problem they worked on the most, the one that the groups concentrated on, was aircraft survivability. Because at the height of the war, your chances of making it out of the war, if you're on a bomber crew, were about 50-50. A coin toss. So if you could improve the survivability of these people in these airplanes by 1 or 2%, it might turn the entire tide of the war. So this is the problem they sent to the Applied Mathematics Panel. And the group that worked on it was the statistical research group headed up by Abraham Wald in that apartment complex in New York City. Now, he was particularly suited to this task because he wasn't just the world's greatest statistician. He also had lost most of his family in a concentration camp, so he was eager to turn his integers and exponents into bombs and bullets. And his analysis started like this. It was very simple. He introduced these cards, and he gave them out to all the bomber crews, and he said, what I want you to do is when an airplane comes in, mark on this card, just circle where it's been damaged, where it's been shot. And then I'll stack them all up and we'll get a picture of what's going on. And he found that over time, what you get is that the bullets concentrate on the center of the plane, out there on the tail, out here on the wings. And he gave this early analysis over to the commanders in the field, and he went back to work on the problem, and he learned that they thought this was an actionable piece of information. They started armoring these locations. And when he found that out, he said, whoa, please, stop what you're doing. You're making a huge, horrible mistake. And I like to imagine that all these generals got their cigars and they chomped down on them, and they were like, oh, what are you talking about there, Wald? You did a bang-up job of this analysis here. And he said to them, look, just look at this for a second, okay? These planes made it home, holes and all, which means this is where an airplane can be shot and survive. You're worried about the airplanes that didn't make it back. And we can reasonably assume they were shot where these planes were not. So the holes show you where the planes are the strongest. You want to put the armor where they've never been shot. And that's what they did, and it was the right decision, and it really did turn the tide of the war. And he knew to do this, and he knew that people would make this mistake. even though the fate of the world was on the line, because we're prone to something called survivorship bias. And survivorship bias is just the tendency to focus on survivors instead of whatever you would call a non-survivor, depending on the situation. In this case, it's the living instead of the dead. In our case, it's successes instead of failures. But it can also just be, in general, winners instead of losers. Because in any incident where there's a process that leaves behind survivors, the non-survivors are usually destroyed or muted or completely removed from our view. When that happens, it just becomes invisible. All that data you could be collecting about what not to do disappears from the field. And so naturally, you pay more attention to the people on the cover of magazines. And not only do you fail to recognize that what's missing might have important information, you fail to recognize there's any missing information at all. A good example of this are frontier log cabins. I know this photographer named Mike Johnston. He takes pictures of these frontier log cabins. He presents them to audiences, and they always say the same thing. Wow, they just don't know how to build them like they used to. And he says, I think you're getting this all wrong. I'm like, no, look at this thing. It's beautiful. The one here on the left, it's beautiful. We could make something like that today with modern materials. And he says, no, I know a lot about log cabins. 90% of all log cabins were built, and then they fell right over. Or they didn't survive their first bout with bad weather. Or they were built with bad materials, and they rotted. Whatever happened, they only survived a couple years. The only ones that are around for me to take pictures of are the extremely lucky ones who are either built with amazing materials that nobody else had, or they're in a location where they could survive weather that's not too harsh. So my pictures misrepresent to you the idea of log cabins because these survivors skew your perception in the direction of luck. Likewise, you could imagine this is what happens with the restaurant business. If you're in an area where there are a lot of really successful restaurants, they're usually super successful. They make money hands over fist. And you might think as you're eating, man, maybe I got in the wrong business. I should get into the restaurant business. But if you see a cluster of super successful businesses, that is an indication of a business you should avoid. It could be restaurants, it could be apps. The reason is it shows that you must be minimally super successful to survive the culling process that removed all the failures. With restaurants, all the failures go away. They disappear. They go out of business. The only thing left for you to look at are the successful restaurants that skew your perception in the direction of the survivors. And the same is true for a celebrity, whether it's in Hollywood or in business, like Brad Pitt, for example, someone who's very talented, very driven, very attractive. But there were lots of talented, driven, attractive people who came to Hollywood the day he came to Hollywood. And he's invited to get on stage and give advice, but they're not because they had to go back home. And he can't give you advice on what not to do. Only they can. The reason is because all his decisions worked out for him. And that's why you have to be careful when you only get advice or you only read about or you only absorb and pore over material that comes from the super successful, whether it's books about businesses, whether it's biographies, whether it's interviews or people on stage, because most of the time they don't know why they're successful because all their decisions worked out for them. They were lucky. The great psychologist Daniel Kahneman said in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, a stupid decision that works out well becomes a brilliant decision in hindsight. And he looked at all of these businesses, and he went to the moment when they were struggling the most, when they had no idea what was going to happen, and things looked really bad. And he looked to see, did any one of them have any idea that the decision that they were about to make would save them, would lead them to the companies we know of today? And he found it was never true. What happened when they tell you about their story is that they look back in hindsight when there was nothing but chaos, but they see order. And so he said, when you group successes together and you look for what makes them similar, the only real answer will be luck. So, is this weird and unsettling? I don't think so. Not if you have a post-scientific understanding of what luck really is. So let me tell you what that is. Many researchers have looked at this, but I like Richard Wiseman's the most because he's a really funny, weird guy, and he makes really cool studies, and he's also a magician. He's really neat. He's Darren Brown's science advisor, and he did this study. It lasted 10 years. He had 400 different subjects. They all self-identified as being either lucky or unlucky. And then he went and interviewed their friends and family. And he said, hey, is this person actually lucky? Is this person actually unlucky? And they were like, yeah, things always work out for this guy, or no, nothing ever works out for this person. And he divided them up, and he did a series of experiments with them. one of them, my favorite one, is he had them look at a newspaper. He said, it's a big, big newspaper, and he said, I want you to tell me how many photographs are in this newspaper. And if you can give me the right number in less than a minute, I'll give you $250, no questions asked. But what he didn't tell them is that on the second page of the newspaper, he had printed in big, bold letters, stop counting, there are 43 photographs in the newspaper. And what he found was there was a huge, strong correlation between people who were lucky and people who saw that. The unlucky people tended not to see it at all. They just fussed around with the paper and they got the answer wrong. And he found this all across his research. Unlucky people are so focused on the goal, they're so focused on the end result of what they're doing, they're so focused on what their company is all about, that they don't have the ability to examine the periphery of all this chaos that is offering all these opportunities they could switch over to, because they would have to abandon the track that they're on. Lucky people, on the other hand, do this no problem. In fact, he said, the harder they looked, the less they saw. And so it is with luck. Unlucky people miss chance opportunities because they're too focused on looking for something else. And he created a personality profile for these two types of people. Unlucky people are narrowly focused, they crave security, they're fixated on control, they prefer routines. These are the people who are still in your hometown. The lucky people are people who abandon routines. They're really totally okay with failure. They're willing to fail so much that they fail more often than the other group. And they expose themselves more to chance, and when they do fail, they just shrug it off and they try again. So this is a great thing for you to put in your head as you go through this conference, because this is a conference built around these two different ideas. First of all, you're going to meet a lot of people who aren't focused on how they succeeded. They're focused on how they got past all their failures. And they're going to tell you what not to do because they've done the thing that you shouldn't do several times. So that's good. Find those people in your list of speakers. And the other thing is, you're about to be exposed to a great deal of chaos. You're about to be exposed to all this randomness. So you can, instead of focusing on why you came here or focusing on the very specific track, I urge you to throw some darts at the schedule and expose yourself to things you have no interest in or you think you have no interest in. There's no telling what will happen. Because Richard Wiseman said to use this thought experiment as your guide. He imagined an apple orchard. And at this apple orchard there are two different strategies that one could use to get all the apples. It's a mystical apple orchard, to get as many as you can. Strategy one is the unlucky person. They go into the orchard, they find the first tree that looks okay, and they stick to it, and they go to it every day, and they have a basket every day. The lucky person says, I'm going to pick a different tree every day, no matter what I find. And at the end of the day, they compare their baskets. And what they find is that the person who's generally unlucky has about the same thing every day. And the lucky person has a different haul every day. And sometimes when they compare, the unlucky person looks over and says, oh yeah, see, I knew I should have stuck with what I know. But sometimes the lucky person has this amazing haul. And in those moments, that is when person A looks at person B and says, man, how could a person be so lucky? Thank you.